me. And thanks everyone for joining. So I'm Yang. I'm basically working as an engineer on this small, wonderful team on this project called Plasmic. And yeah, I'm excited to be here and share a little bit about Plasmic. It's really something that started a while back as a passion project, and it's something I hope can be used to all React developers, but also just interesting to learn about as a React project itself. It's definitely been a big source of challenges and learnings, both technical and otherwise. So I'll jump right into it. First, I'll start with a kind of overview about what Plasmic, new visual UI builder for React, and we wanted to solve two different problems with it. So the first problem is from our experience working on product teams for a long time. Basically, just using React and building front ends generally, working with designers, etc. And I'm actually curious before going ahead. I'm not sure if there's a better way to do this in Zoom, but I'm curious just to poll the folks here on how many of you work with a designer. Maybe just mention in chat. I'm always curious. But yeah, so this is to learn about as a React project itself is technical and otherwise. So our experience on these product teams is one where collaboration with design can be complex and I'm actually curious before we'll folks here on I'm always curious. After drawings that engineers have to recreate from scratch by hand using code, right? And a lot of things can get missed in that translation because it turns out that we as developers really suck at catching everything, or are just hard to translate because designs are freeform drawings. So this leads to a lot of back and forth with design, and ultimately you have these two sources of truth that by most teams admission is never truly in sync. So we wanted to streamline that collaboration and that translation process. Cool. So a number of folks do work with designers. Yeah, this is actually most folks don't work with the designer, and that was also the case for me for a lot of my experience, at least working in small startups, etc. Just kind of get by. And so leads me to the second goal, which is a little more selfishly just wanting better and sort of rethought development experience for those of us who are building front ends. So this is so we can move a lot faster, but at the same time, eliminate an entire class of visual bugs and QA and related tooling. UI builders are nothing new. They're actually quite widely used. They've generated perfectly fine code that ships into all sorts of major apps for a long time. Very successful on other platforms like iOS and Android and Windows. There's kind of a clear company backing the platform. So we wanted to bring some of that to the web. So Plasmic is, basically this visual UI builder for React that lets developers or designers, we're trying to keep it accessible to designers as well, but let you craft these, complex presentational components, real world front-end surfaces that you can import into your code base and just use and render. So the idea is to let you, move a lot faster and fix designer developer collaboration. So that's a lot of words about, the what and why of this. But for this next part, I will jump into a demo. So this will just kind of, we'll quickly run through a flow of using this thing just to get a sense of, what it does and how it works and all that. So this is a tool. It's a browser-based sort of studio editor. And for this demo, I'm actually going to be building out this to-do MVC, which just as a refresher, this is kind of what it looks like roughly. We're not going to build this whole thing exactly. We're just going to build a small subset of it. But yeah, so the kind of flow that we wanted to enable with this was one where you can just start by quickly slapping ideas onto the screen, drawing things freeform, etc. And so this is how I'm starting here as well. I'm just creating this title, styling it kind of how I want, looking for the right color here, and roughly placing it, I'm going to draw a card for the first task right below it. And maybe I'll first make the background of the whole page this off-white, warm gray. And then I'll set this card itself to be pure white. And maybe this is, inside the card, I want a box for my actual checkbox, which I will make rounded and give it a light border, remove that background fill, and right next to it, I'll add some text for the actual tag, for the actual tasks. So buy some milk, I'll make that a little bit larger. That's better, and then give it a certain lighter hue, and I'll save this color actually as my generic reusable text color. So anyway, these are kind of the this is the flow that we want to enable, just like really rapid iteration on just like if you're finding the right shade of color or whatever it is, it's just not guessing through code or like trying to figure out what flex spaces to use or copying values back and forth from DevTools. Just letting you like very quickly build out these UIs. And everything so far is just very roughly placed on the screen, absolute positioning everywhere. But that's okay. That's actually the core philosophy that we wanted to enable, which is starting with even very rough designs, and from there refining them incrementally into something that is robust, hygienic, production ready. And so yeah, that's what we want to let you do. Just start rough, refine, have something real. So this is my task so far. And from here, I'm going to right-click this thing, and because I want multiple tasks, not just one task in my task manager, I'm going to turn this into a reusable component called task. And now I can instantiate this a bunch of times, like so. And just in this rough vertical list. But let's say I want these to be in a real list, arranged vertically. So I'm going to lasso these things into a vertical stack. And what these vertical stacks do is they keep everything distributed online automatically. And this is actually something that is, because we're powered by the real web platform, this is using like, real Flexbox, et cetera, under the hood. But we've basically added a bunch of controls to streamline using Flexbox. And this is, one of the big things in Plasmic is streamlining layout controls. And just to make things faster and more intuitive. So because it can get pretty hairy. But let's say I'm going to first remove this background color, and I'm going to snap everything to the top and maybe to the left. And I'm also going to double click these edges to auto size the content vertically and horizontally as well. So these are some of the simpler layout things in Flexbox, but I'll show some more interesting examples in a little bit. And I'll call this whole thing my task list. This helps me keep my elements, my component organized, but also it'll come in handy later for the actual code integration. By the way, feel free to jump in with questions or interrupt me. I'm not typically monitoring the chat very closely as I'm going through this. I'm just kind of flying through this demo so I can get to the next part of the talk. But I guess Joe or anyone can feel free to interrupt me if there's anything that comes up. Cool. So this is the the task component that I have so far, and it's kind of boring right now. All the tasks say the exact same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click this component first to start editing it, and this is a feature where you can kind of edit in place any component, the primary copy of any component. And so if I make any changes to this thing, you'll see that reflected everywhere. But you can do that in place from wherever the components are used. Now I'm going to select this text, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click it and choose Convert to a Slot. And what this does is slots are basically, you can think of it as poking a hole in the component, so that from outside of the component, from any one of these instances, I can select that slot and I can change its content. So something I do is just change text, make to show a demo. And that's really simple. But you can really drop in anything you want into these slots, any other elements. So it's a flexible way to achieve component composition. And so yeah, basically the way to think about it is it's like similar to children style props in React components. So now that I have these different texts on these different tasks, the last thing I want to do with this component is actually introduce different states into it. So this is very common for components generally, just having them look differently in different conditions. And so that's what I'm going to do. I kind of right-click that component to pop it out into its own new artboard here on the side. And this is just basically artboards are views of components. So I can create as many of these views as I want, different views of the component, and we'll see how that helps me work with it in a little bit. But basically, let's say now I want to introduce some state to this task. And the way we model that in Plasmic is through this concept of variants. And so I'm going to create a variant group for various states. And maybe the first one is my completed state. I want to design what it looks like when it's completed, or when it's being edited, or when it's marked high priority. So these are all different states the component can exist in. But for this demo, I'm just going to design out what it looks like in its completed state. And for that, I would just want there to be a check mark in this checkbox. So for that check mark, I actually like the check mark from this reference app here, which I will screen grab just real quickly. And then I'm going to paste it back in here. And I'm actually going to zoom into a pixel level to adjust things a little more fine grain. And you can also use auto layout and whatnot. But that is my check mark in the completed state. And just to show you what's going on, I'm going to switch between my base appearance and my completed appearance. So these two are looking different. And basically what variants are is it's recording some specific deltas or overrides that exist in this completed state that weren't in the base state. So I can also show you what's going on by taking this whole artboard and duplicating it and setting this one to be looking at the base state here. So you can see the two side by side. And if you're familiar with things like Storybook, et cetera, it's the same philosophy here, just letting you be able to work on like a component in isolation, and that can help you just like focus and set it up in a certain configuration. So now that I have my check mark, maybe the only other thing I want to do for the completed state is have the text be strikeout. Let's say here. And I'm also going to adjust the text color actually a little bit, make it very faint. So you can configure whatever you want inside of that component in these different variants. So this is my completed state. Now the thing about variants is that you can combine any number of them. And so for instance, let's say I also cared about a hover state for this task. So whenever I hover over any part of this task, I want this, this circle here to become darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first create that hover state here, and I'm going to directly set it to be darker, like so. And in fact, I can now try out this effect by going to live mode. And now I can interact with this thing, and it's close to what I want. But I realize another thing that I want is actually for the pointer to also change into a hand pointer down here. I'm just going to set that and try it again. And okay, that's better. That's more what I want. And so now with those variants defined, they actually come with the component everywhere it goes. So back in my main screen, I can select any one of these instances, and I can say I want to set this one to be in complete state. I can also preview this whole thing to see what it looks like, behaves. It's a little nuanced here, but you can notice that we are dynamically combining the hover state and the completed state. And this is just because we're only recording deltas on top of the base parents of the component. And so what I mean by that is, if I go back here and I switch to my base appearance, if I make some change to this task, it's not like these are two separate hard copies of the same thing that I have to maintain. I can edit the base appearance, and that will bleed through to the variants as well. So that's kind of how these variants work. let's see. So so that was pretty much it for what I wanted to do with this app. Maybe the last thing is I'll tighten it up with some real layout around the whole screen, and make them flow as a column, center everything, and maybe introduce some padding to the top and bottom. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'll call this whole thing my to-do app. So I have these two components, my task and my to-do app component. And from here, the next part is about turning this into real code that you can work with. And now from there, you can add the real logic and state and event handlers and all that kind of stuff. So if you have any, if you're also just like working on a static website or static HTML website, then there's less to do. But for some like interactive application like this, the ability to drop into the code is really important. So for that, a really simple way to get going is to use this Code Sandbox integration. And so just you click this button, and what it does is it spins up a new sandbox containing exactly the components that you created in the designer, running as these pixel perfect renditions in a standalone web app. So this is the React app, and you can explore all the various components here. But this is one way to get going. It's just an easy way to start prototyping directly in the browser. Another thing you can do, which is much more interesting, is actually doing real code gen. So this is accomplished through this client that Plasmic provides, which is something I already have installed. So I'm going to skip that step. But then these are the two other steps for getting things going. And basically, whenever you want to run Plasmic in a code base for the first time, you just run this Plasmic init command, which I'm going to copy here. And I have this terminal pulled up where this is actually a blank sort of brand new create React app package that we have here. Let's see, and I can actually show you it running. This is what a blank React app looks like, and so it's just a spinning logo. But in this directory, what I'll do is I will paste that Plasmic init command. Whoops, Plasmic init command, and it'll just kind of guide you through a bunch of questions here. Like, I'll just go with the defaults. And the next step is really syncing down the two components that we have, the task component and the to-do app component. So I'm going to paste that here as well, right after this, like so. And we should see those two components appear. Now, just to show you what's going on, basically, we added the this Plasmic JSON config, and the components get dumped into source components by default. But you can configure that. And I'll first pull up my code editor to show what's going on. The first thing I'll do, I'll have the app running on the right, is to get things onto the screen. So I'm going to replace all this spinning logo stuff with to-do app, that first component that we synced down. I'm just going to render it as is. And yeah, so that should get us our sort of pixel perfect rendition of what was in the designer. Now, from here, what I want to do, and by the way, this is like, all the details are fully captured here. It's not some like lossy rendition, because in the designer, what you're designing is actually the real thing running in the final medium, right? So so that's why you get exactly what you created running pixel perfect here, without having to write a single line of of code, presentational or anything. So from here, I want to wire this up to the real behavior data, etc. And for that, maybe all I want to do is I'm just going to get some of my own state reflected in this list. I don't want to show this static list of 3 mocks. I want to show like my own data, right? And so maybe my data lives in some simple React state, so I'll just add that here. So I'll have some tasks that live in some React state. And these tasks are just JavaScript objects with a name property, like do stuff, like so. And I'll make 3 copies of this. And from here, basically, this to-do app it's a very simple, thin wrapper around a Plasmic to-do app component. And so the Plasmic to-do app component is this dumb presentational component that all it does is just render things onto the screen with the right styling, etc., in a certain configuration variance. And it takes as props a really flexible set of overrides that let you basically configure any element inside of that component with any of the real props that you want. So for instance, I can reach in here and directly edit the task list element. If you remember that, the one that we named earlier, is just this whole list. And I'm going to replace all of its content with this actual list of tasks that are rendered using this this second component here. And this is the other component that we synced down, the task component. So now if I save this, we should see my data actually reflected in the running app. So this is how you can work with these generated presentational components. You just import them into your code base, you render them, and you can pass in any configuration of props, etc., very easily and flexibly. So if I want some click handler on these things, I can also add that. So it's just very flexible in that regard. Cool. So that is pretty much it for what I wanted to show for this this code integration. Now, from here, this is actually not just a one-time eject. This is a key property of Plasmic is that it lets you it keeps the link live between the design and the code, so that you can go back to the design and continue iterating it and refining it. And this is important because products are iterated on, right? So I'm going to go back to my terminal first, and I'm going to turn on watch mode, which basically streams any of the edits that we make in the Studio Designer into our code base live. And now there, I'm going to have my to-do app running on the right, and I'm going to switch back to my Studio Editor and have that on the left. I'll resize these windows a little bit. And now let's say I wanted to make some violent changes to the layout of this whole thing. So what I want to do is I'll turn these this vertical list of tasks into a more boxy looking set of tiles. So I'll double click this component to drill into editing it. And here I will start, maybe I'll just start by making it look more boxy. I'll add some real layout to this thing, so make everything laid out as a row. That's aligned to the top. I'm going to add some padding all around. And I'm going to take this checkbox and pop it out of its place to be free floating. I'll move it to the bottom right-ish. I'll pin it to the right and to the bottom. And maybe from there, that's pretty much actually the task that I, this new look for the task. Now, everything is still arranged vertically. So this is where I'm going to select that task list. And I'm going to change everything to be a row layout. Now, everything is going to spill over the side. So what I can do is I can turn on wrapping, so things actually wrap around. And I'm going to resize this a little bit to make them centered. It's hard for me to tell apart the different tasks right now. So I'm going to also introduce some gap in between them, some gap in the vertical axis and also in the horizontal axis. So these are starting to show some of the more interesting features of the layout engine at play. And things like gaps in flexboxes. If you think about how you achieve that today, usually you are dealing with some hacky CSS selector specificity violating things, and it's just one of these very common things, like many things in layout controls that Plasmic tries to streamline as much as possible. So yeah, and as you can see, as we were making those changes, things were streaming live into the running app and into our code base. So that is pretty much it. That all I wanted to show for the demo. I'm going to switch back to my slides. Oops, over here. Great. I guess let's see. First thing I wanted to dive into is the challenges with this, with working on Plasmic, and I'll start with some technical challenges. But I think a big one that is a constant for us at every turn is worrying about the. So this tool is itself a React application, and there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of moving parts, a lot of state, and a lot of that state is quite sprawling, but it stems from this core data model that is the project itself, right? Our representation of UIs and these components and elements on the screen, etc. And in order to, we have a lot of operations that are like, for instance, these drag operations or whatnot, that we want to keep snappy and responsive. So what that means is, you have typically these frame budgets that you're dealing with. Of if you're shooting for 60 FPS, then you have like 16 milliseconds per frame to do all of your work. And so that kind of starting with that constraint and working backwards, it means a lot of time spent worrying about our state management infrastructure and making sure that it is really fast and specifically low latency, but also scalable. And what I mean by that is, right now this is a very simple project with these 3 artboards on the screen, but you can imagine a much more sprawling one with like hundreds of artboards and much more complex components in each one. And in that case, our job is really to still keep everything really snappy and responsive. And the way we do that essentially is by constantly breaking up work into as small and incremental chunks as possible, so that you can and you can see a little bit of this actually if I am if I'm moving around one of these this checkbox here. If I am just like dragging it around, you can kind of see it also updating on these artboards to the right, but there's a little bit of latency before we update those, and that's because we are breaking up this work into incremental bite-sized chunks and kind of lazily propagating that to the other artboards, for instance, and we're able to do that fairly easily because these artboards, each of these is actually a separate iframe running its own React application. So there's like a total of 4 applications that are running right now on the screen, and we each one is a React TypeScript application, and the studio is kind of directly manipulating the applications that are running in these iframes, and we basically try not to synchronously, just update everything at once all the time, but always breaking this up into small pieces and only also doing the minimal amount of work that's necessary. So for instance, if this is for this React app here, we're not trying to re-render the whole React tree every time. We're just trying to re-render the specific part of the tree that needs updating, for instance. Yeah. So there's a lot of challenges there. Also a lot of challenges around code components. So basically, I haven't shown that here in this demo, but the ability to use real code components, maybe these are components you already have in your code base, but maybe they're an existing component library from like, Material UI or Ant or Bootstrap or something like that that you want to use, and being able to drop those in means basically it meant a lot of work around dynamically loading modules into the app, but also letting you like automatically reflecting out the props and the configurations that these components take. So oftentimes these are things that are documented through TypeScript types or React prop types, or maybe even flow types. So that's the kind of stuff that gives us hints as to what kind of, for instance, controls we want to expose for these components. Maybe they should be knobs on the right-hand side, or it can be nuanced, right? Because some props are children-style props, and for those, you want to actually be able to more naturally manipulate them on the canvas as opposed to through some sidebar. And so this is the kind of stuff that we kind of tease out as automatically as possible through the we have this tool chain for basically crawling your code base and finding all these components and reflecting out introspecting them for their interfaces. The second set of challenges is some product challenges, and I think a big one is making layout intuitive. So if you think about what is like distilling layout into a small set of intuitive controls. For instance, if you want two text divs sitting side by side to horizontally stretch to fill the available space given to them, you might just try setting flex to 1 on each one. But you may or may not be surprised at the result. There's always an explanation, right? Like flex row is something that multiplies the flex basis, and acceleration that basis defaults to the width, which is always defaulting to auto, which in this case, at least for divs, which in this case means max content size. And so if effectively you have these two text divs that are different speed text that's in them at the current time, which is crazy. But I think this is just like one small example of a very common routine everyday pitfall of working with CSS, where there's 10 different ways to do everything, and it's hard to understand exactly what are the nuances with each one. Like, why not set 50% width on these text divs? Like, what are the downsides to that? And so that is the stuff where we wanted to streamline that as much as possible. And most of the time you just want things to stretch, right? Stretch to fill available space given to them, or to tightly hug its content, or to be a fixed pixel or percentage size. And that's kind of what we wanted to unify and simplify in the CSS model. The second I think product challenge is around, I showed in this demo creating things from scratch, but if you go to our website and watch the demo there, we're actually showing a different flow where you can start with a design that you've already created in something like Figma or Sketch on one of these design tools. Maybe you're a designer you work with has already created these, and from there you can actually import that into Plasmic. And what's going on under the hood is all this stuff around mapping for instance, the Figma document representation into web standards and CSS, HTML, and that kind of thing. So this is where just a lot of low-level grungy work around dealing with layer masks and centered borders and their own gradient system and blend modes, because all these design tools, they come from a more graphic design pedigree, right? So that's why you have things like layers and blend modes, and in dealing with all that and translating that into the web medium, there's just a lot of work there. So basically giving you this starting point that is very high fidelity to the original design, and then from there you can refactor that design into something that is robust for production using the real correct component structure, etc. So this is what this set of challenges is just mapping those concepts across different representations. But I think our most interesting challenge is really this one around code integration. So if you think about what's natural for visual direct manipulation and what's natural for expressing in code, we want to marry the best of both worlds and find the most natural and flexible interface for doing so. We want to try and take away the burden of keeping your code in sync with the design, but at the same time giving you the freedom to build and structure the component code as you see fit. This is for both necessary practical reasons, like you just need to instrument that data or that event handler into your design, but also more quote-unquote aesthetic reasons as well. So what I mean by that is I want to control what the prop interface to my components looks like. Right? I don't want this, for instance, this task component here to take a children prop and to take some state that to render it in, for instance. I want it to take some kind of task entity object, right, that I'm passing in, and it internally is figuring out all the the right children, etc., to render internally. So that's what I mean by giving you control over the component interface. So yeah. So starting with that, that's kind of our goal, right? Is to give as much flexibility as possible, so that the code generation is always there to help and never to hinder. From there, we kind of arrived at two different schemes that are complete polar opposites of each other, actually. So these are the two schemes that we offer today. The first is this presentational library scheme, which is the one I showed already, where essentially we generate for each component 2 different files. There's the the Plasmic to-do app. Undo all this so it's not distracting us. This Plasmic to-do app, for instance, that's this dumb presentational component that just renders things on the screen, and then the to-do app component, which is a thin wrapper around it, which is actually this whole file is just scaffolding that we generate for you the first time, and it gives you space to add your logic and state and behavior, etc. But you can do whatever you want with this file. You can blow away this whole component. You can change it to a class-based component. You can render something that is entirely different and is not the Plasmic to-do app, but like some other component. It doesn't really matter. You can do whatever you want here. And yeah, that's really the way this presentational library scheme works. It's very simple. We just give you these presentational components that you can do whatever you want with. And these are the ones that are actually managed and owned by Plasmic and basically regenerated every time you are syncing. But we don't touch like this file, for instance, this one up here. So that's kind of how that scheme works. Hopefully that made sense. Let me know if that was confusing or if I can explain that better. But yeah, in the developer-owned component, you can do whatever you want with it. So go to the next one, which is the direct edit scheme. This is the opposite philosophy, which is we give you these it's actually a fun one to demo, but I'm going to show real quickly the configure everything to be changed from this presentational scheme to the direct edit scheme, just to show you what it does. And I'm going to Plasmic sync again, but I'll blow away my existing files, and let's see what happens. So in this scheme, we actually give you a transparent JSX tree that you can directly work with. So for instance, let's say I wanted to take these tasks, these mock tasks, delete them all. I'm going to wrap this in a sort of loop that is iterating over some tasks that I have defined elsewhere, and rendering them. And maybe I want this title to be a little more enthusiastic, and maybe also I want to wrap that title in some Mombex observer that I have somewhere, and I'm also going to add an on-click handler to this thing, etc. So you can make whatever changes you want. I'm going to add a footer here, div in the bottom. And I'm going to save that, and I'm going to have it on the right, and I'm going to have my app running on the left. And I'm going to, as I make changes to the code or the design, I'm going to start Plasmic Watch again. Have my code on the right, I have my studio on the left, and as I'm making more changes, you can kind of see things streaming, those changes streaming into my my code base. For instance, I added a div here to the middle that shows up, and so you can just like continue iterating on the design in this way. And effectively, what we're doing is we're constantly rebasing your latest changes on the latest presentational code. And just wrapping up here, there's a bunch of takeaways on the impact for our workflow, but I think the most interesting one is this one, where if you do work with designers, then there's something magical about just running Plasmic Sync and you get a nicer version of your presentational components already appearing, like a nicer version of your landing page or whatnot appearing in your code that you can just directly ship. And I think this is the most fun part, which is just seeing what people are building on this thing. It's still really early days for us, but we have a small set of users currently that are using this to build all these different things. I think the most interesting one is this autonomous vehicle. These LiDAR sensors on autonomous vehicles that like a control panel for those. It's the most out there thing I think that I've seen so far. And of course, Plasmic itself is built and constructed in Plasmic. So all this Chrome that you see around the sides of the app, this dashboard here, you can kind of see. I'll show you our own Plasmic kit. And while that's loading, I think I saw that from Oh, are there questions? I think. Oh, sorry. I thought I saw a question scroll by, but I think that was just another notification I got. Cool. So yeah, this is kind of our Plasmic project. You can kind of see what our settings page looks like with the different access tokens, our many different types of buttons. Oops. And like our things like our share dialog, which is just up here, and our code sandbox dialog, which is the thing over here, and our the left pane, which is all these things here, and our many icons, and our dashboard as well, like the main project list that you were seeing at the start. So yeah, all these different surfaces, are things that we have built in Plasmic itself as well. So that is pretty much it. Thank you for listening. It's still really early days. We actually just launched or just publicly announced this thing for the first time like two days ago. So yeah, it's been fun and exciting. If you're interested in playing with this, please go ahead and sign up there.
Cool. Thanks. So we'll have some time for questions, but I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to take off if they need to get back from lunch. Next month, I think Kevin will be talking to us about Webpack. Oh, I've already forgotten, Kevin. If you remember, jump on and say.
Module Federation. With
That's
Webpack
it. Yeah, Module Federation. So that should be pretty good. So we hope to see you there. Otherwise, feel free to stay on and ask questions. Otherwise, we'll see you next month.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions at all. No dumb questions.
So how do you handle like component versions and that kind of stuff? Like, for instance, if you wanted to use this to develop a library of components that you can use across various projects, like how do you handle like branching pathways in that kind of situation?
Yeah, great question. So if you want to, for instance, build like some component library that you are then consuming upstream from other projects, you can always basically tie that this project file into a specific, you can sync this down into a specific React package, basically, that you're working on, and then import that package into the other React packages that you consume it from. And so in that way, we're pretty agnostic actually as to the structure and the way you want to, architect or break things up. You can you can import these components into any code base at any point. Now the thing about I think the versioning is that you actually are able to in Plasmic, there's the ability to revert to any prior version of the design, and so whatever you import into your code base and integrate there, it's actually version stamped, and so you always are able to have a deterministic set of things that you're looking at any point in time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Great question.
So I have a question. Could you go into your demo, the live version? I just want to see what the CSS it creates is.
Oh yeah, of course. So let me just pull up my code here. So this is all the stuff that we're trying to take care of for you. But yeah, this is all the stuff that I was specifying in the design tool. Applied to these different elements, but also to the various states of those elements. So if you look at the Plasmic task CSS, there's something in here for like the hover state. There's something in here for like the completed state, for instance. And you can yeah.
So does it handle any sort of theming or, you know, white label theming? It looks like it just kind of creates a static file.
Yeah, it creates a static file. So the theming you can actually do visually in Plasmic itself. So the way that works is, if for instance I am going back to my to-do app, I think it was this one. Too many untitled projects. Let's say so there's a bunch of style abstractions that I haven't shown here in this demo, but including like tokens and mixins. And the way that works is if you are, I think actually this text was set to be a text color token. Yeah, you can define as many of these tokens as you want, and these can also be recursively defined. And so you can have like a layer of tokens that is just like blue 100 through blue 900, and then a layer of tokens above that that's like my primary accent color is blue 400. And then on top of that, your components and whatnot, they actually reference the primary color, primary accent color, or what have you. And so that's one way you can actually visually theme and style these things as you want. And when you do that, we actually, so if you use one of these token managers, like if you've heard of Salesforce design tokens manager, I think it was called Theo, yeah. So we, for instance, generate Theo files for you that you can actually use. So from there, you have whatever you want. You want CSS variables, you want Sass variables, you want things in some other platform. Like you can get all those out that way. So we generate these Theo files, and then you just run Theo to like generate all the reusable abstractions that you want. And yeah, we also have, besides tokens, mixins as well. So the mixins are the ability to take any bundle of styles and apply them onto any element consistently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
So I feel like, is this only meant to be used for presentational components essentially, and then statefulness is handled outside of each of these components that's generated, or can you kind of throw some statefulness into these?
Yeah, so the line we want to draw was exactly focusing on presentational concerns here. So using the visual tool to do the visual work, and then all the behavior, like state, we're not trying to be an end-to-end app builder or like a no-code tool, right? This is a tool for ourselves to use as a team of developers and designers working on products. So this is we like code, we like TypeScript, we like types, we like all these things that are really nice and convenient to use. It's not we're not trying to reinvent programming or anything like that. There are definitely, I think end-to-end app builders out there that are more focused on, maybe giving you less control over like exactly how this app works. But what you want to do happens to be something that they can accommodate. Then, great, you can you can do that. And I think, there's definitely a bunch of these. Like I think Bubble is one of these that I like. That's an end-to-end app builder. But yeah, that's kind of our philosophy was to build something for development teams.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
Awesome.
Anyone else? Oh, go ahead. I'll let you wrap up.
Yeah. If there's nothing else, then thank you again for just tuning in, and feel free to sign up and play with it. And actually, if you sign up, our list of signups is currently like under 1,000 people long. So if you can just mention that you found us through this meetup, then yeah, we'll send you an invite.